Once upon a time, there was a king, my young readers will say right away. No, children, you're mistaken. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. It wasn't a fancy piece of wood, just an ordinary log. The kind that, in winter, you put in stoves and fireplaces to light the fire and warm up the rooms.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome everyone. 10 episodes, a long series then to read the story of Pinocchio. One might say, what's the need or what could possibly be said in 10 episodes about a story that practically every Italian knows by heart? Perhaps it could be, though we actually won't manage it, perhaps it could be read in its entirety over 10 evenings. The thing is, regarding this story that we all know, I would like to attempt a rather original reading, which, moreover, I owe not to my own brilliance, but to the brilliance of a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, the late Cardinal Giacomo Biffi. What is original about his approach? It is that at a certain point in his life, he explains this well, that he discovered, let's say, that he intuited the answer to a question that had accompanied him since he was a child. He had read Pinocchio as the first book of his life. It was given to him by his father on a specific date and occasion. He reads it, and this book accompanies him more or less throughout his life. And he says about himself that he doesn't really understand why it fascinated him so much. For a while, he sets it aside, then he picks it up again. And he recounts that later, at a certain age, in his youth, during his university studies, he has a sudden revelation. The right idea comes to him. It seems to him that incredibly, the tale of Pinocchio, the story of Pinocchio, can be read as a great metaphor for the history of humanity, and therefore a great metaphor for the story of each of us. Not only that, but with an astonishing, absolutely extraordinary coincidence between the content of this story and history as it is told by Catholic doctrine, as it is told in the Bible, in short. He picks up the text again, rereads it from this perspective, reflects on it for years, and eventually publishes a book called Against Master Cherry, a theological commentary on the Adventures of Pinocchio. For my part, I have had a similar experience. A similar experience because in my youth, I taught religion for several years. And I remember well that summer, I was wondering how to approach it, what to say. In short, I was a novice teacher. It was my second year of teaching. That summer, that autumn of 1977, I happened to come across this book. It piqued my curiosity and excited me, and it became the religion textbook I used for 8 or 9 years in my teaching. For Catholic religion in the public school, before I later became a literature teacher, a book that has accompanied me for many years, it never left me. I always say, half jokingly, that it is the third element of the trilogy I would keep on my nightstand: Dante's Divine Comedy, Milos's Miguel Mañara, and Pinocchio. These are the 3 books that in some way have truly accompanied so many choices, so many turning points, so many moments in my life, even professional decisions, as I might have the chance to explain. So, to understand this strange thing a little, we need to spend a few minutes providing some context, to provide some context for the book, because it has an extraordinary, very unusual story. I don't know if you know this, Pinocchio was born as a story, a serialized story by this man, Carlo Collodi, Carlo Lorenzini. Some have called him an atheist, an anti-clerical, but he would write to his mother, always reassuring her about his Catholic faith. In short, let's put it this way. A man who grew up in the Christian tradition in his childhood and early youth, certainly absorbed a certain atmosphere, a certain sense, what we commonly call a Catholic culture, thanks also to the education he received from his mother. Consider that he studied in a seminary in Colvaldelsa, then moved to the Piarists in Florence. So he also received an explicitly religious education from religious teachers. And then, like many young people of his time, he became fascinated by the ideals of the Risorgimento, which were very secular. At first, he followed them with great enthusiasm, the teachings and doctrines of Mazzini. Then he distances himself a bit, but in short, to make a long story short, he is a man who, when he decides in 75, disappointed by how things are going, by how the adult world seems to him to deal with life, to deal with the problems of the time, economic, political, and so on, decides to devote himself to children's literature. He is a rather disillusioned man, quite who would prefer to be alone, and who discovers perhaps in the souls of children, discovers in the possibility of connecting with children's sensitivity. So by dedicating himself to writing fables and stories for them, a more genuine and clearer way to express himself. So at a certain point in 1880, at the end of the 1880s, now in his 50s, on the verge of turning 50, he sends a bundle of papers of manuscripts to a friend who is a publisher. These are the first episodes of Pinocchio, to a publisher who runs a children's magazine, a periodical, and he himself calls them childish things. As if to say, I'm sending you these things, they just came to my mind. In between one job and another, in his spare time, just see for yourself, he actually writes. See what you want to do with them. If you think they're worth publishing, publish them. If not, just throw everything away. He himself, therefore, greatly underestimates the work he has just completed. The publisher, on the other hand, reads it. He is very happy, he edits, and that's how it goes. On July 7, 1881, the first installment of Pinocchio is published in this newspaper, the very one we'll read together tonight, the first chapter of Pinocchio. On October 27th, the last installment comes out, which is the 15th chapter where Pinocchio dies. He dies in the sense that he actually dies, that is for the author, the story was supposed to end there. In fact, the newspaper publishes the installment and underneath, in huge letters, it says, the end. But it wasn't the end, not at all, because something incredible happened. Namely, letters started arriving at the newspaper's editorial office from all over Italy, from children all across the country protesting because Pinocchio had died. They protested passionately, and the publisher realized that there was more work to be done. He calls Collodi back, unless he had already left for a trip to Latin America. He calls Collodi back and tells him that the story had to continue. He says how to go to die and resurrects it. He brings him back to life. And as we will see, that death and that resurrection truly mark a kind of turning point. Maybe that's what inspired Cardinal Biffi, that wonderful idea of trying to reinterpret the whole story, just as by following it synoptically, alongside the Bible as the story of humanity. The story of humanity is therefore the story of every man, with its risks that he faces, with the things he learns, with the experience he gains of both good and evil. I haven't done anything else. Then, as is always done, by learning or rather by taking these interpretive hypotheses very seriously, I tried to verify them in myself. When you read a literary work, Dante teaches us, when you read a literary work, what do? Why is it interesting to read? Why do I hope it will be interesting? In these 10 episodes, to reread Pinocchio in this way, because life brings with it a lot of questions, a lot of wounds. And at 60, you realize that you have more questions than answers compared to when you were 20, when you thought you had lots of answers and few questions. Life wounds, life calls you to responsibility, to decisions, to choices. And the beauty of life, in the beauty of literature, the beauty of art, is being able to ask these questions to those who have walked part of the path before you and perhaps have understood something more than you. And you talk to them, you ask them exactly the questions that weigh on you, and you try to learn to understand how others before you have done it. What I will try to do with you is, by following this very original path pointed out by Biffy Ninginda, to see whether the story of Pinocchio can actually be read as our own personal story, and therefore to draw a lot from it, to get a lot out of it. I remember that when I started using it to teach religion, because there are 36 little chapters, so short that you can really read them in 2 or 3 hours. Yet the school year was never enough for me. I never managed to get to the end. The text sparked so much interest, curiosity, questions, and discussion with the classes. So I hope that these 10 episodes have at least this usefulness to spark, or rather, not to spark. Because the real purpose of teaching is not to give answers, but to clarify the questions. So if these 10 evenings help us, if they were to help us clarify the questions, and therefore in some way, because when you clarify the question, you always also clarify a possible answer, one that you have to look for and verify yourself, but someone who teaches you something, teaches you how to frame the questions in the right way. If we could learn this over these 10 episodes from Pinocchio and from Biffy, that alone would be a lot. I need to make a further clarification because sometimes I am accused, or in any case, people who do work like mine are sometimes accused of, let's say, pulling the work a bit in their own direction, that is, of forcing an interpretation onto it. I mean, you could say, but if Collodi was, not to call him an atheist, but in short, he cared little about religion, about religious practice. At certain times, he was certainly also very critical. He was a journalist, very critical of the church, of its temporal power. We're in the mid-1800s. So after all the disaster of the conquest by the Kingdom of Savoy, the unification of Italy, the conquest now of the Papal States. In short, the controversy is extremely heated, and he takes very strong positions against the church. And someone might say, but wait, excuse me, in the whole book, in all the adventures of Pinocchio, there isn't even the slightest reference to God, to the church, let alone the church, but really to God, to the zero. It was Giovanni Spadolini who knew what he was talking about and often commented on Collodi's Pinocchio, who said, as well as being a politician, some may remember, he was also a man of a great culture. He believed that Pinocchio was the great manifesto of a finally secular, or at least a non-religious worldview achieved by the Italian people after the unification of Italy, just to give you an idea. From a certain point of view, that's an absolutely legitimate interpretation. So then you might ask, but how can you claim that Collodi is saying Geppetto is God creating man? Is this interpretation legitimate or not? I could explain it to you in 1,000 ways. But it seems to me that letting the person who had the idea, who developed it, and from whom we are drawing inspiration for these 10 evenings, say it. In other words, saying it in Biffy's own words, is the clearest way, and it saves me from possibly saying something foolish. Also, if you get the chance, read this book. Cardinal Biffy writes in such delightful, beautiful, wonderful Italian, as you'll see. I'm going to read you this page where he explains why he considers the interpretation I mentioned to you to be absolutely legitimate. So much so that he titled his book, Against Master Cherry, a theological commentary, a theological commentary on the Adventures of Pinocchio. He says this: in truth, from the turmoil of the Risorgimento, a unified state did indeed emerge. But a nation that is self-aware and united on the values that give meaning to life did not come into being at all. The upheavals of the 19th century, for the most part, inspired by ideologies foreign to the feelings and convictions of our people, which is to say, inspired. Anyone who has studied a bit of history knows this. In short, it's not inspired by views of life, not exactly consistent with the Catholic tradition of the Italian people. They, in fact, stifled Catholic orthodoxy in every possible way, which was the only conception of reality recognized as their own by all the peoples of Italy. That is, if Italy truly had, and perhaps still has, though maybe not anymore, but certainly at that time it can be said, if it had a common denominator, it was clearly the Christian tradition, Catholic orthodoxy at that time, distorted in the way it was commonly presented. And if that was true in the years after unification, it is even more so now. Distorted in the way it is commonly presented, mocked as backward, scorned by the dominant culture has. Since then, I used to say to myself, we more withdrawn to the depths of people's consciences, waiting for better times. As if to say that this conception of life, of relationships, of things which we define as a Catholic conception, a Christian conception, no longer able or no longer knowing how to express itself, has hidden away, has taken refuge in the depths of people's consciences. In this way, the process of unification has risked making inoperative. In the collective life of Italians, the only element, apart from the widespread fondness for pasta, the only element that from the Alps to Sicily in some way united us. Then he makes an observation, and it's a bit long, but it's beautiful. Come on, I'll read it. Well, because Biffy's irony is amazing, as you've already heard. You can almost picture it. Listen to what he comes up with. Almost a visible image for everyone of the violence done to our most authentic tradition. The squares of our cities suffered in those years. The erection of monuments depicting mustachioed and bearded figures, often on horseback. Monuments that today serve the purpose of reminding those who might have forgotten the ancient merits of the equine species in the advancement of humanity. That says it all. Italy, throughout the second half of the last century, he's talking about the 19th century, the last century, thus re-established its political unity at the expense of its own soul. A harsh, forceful judgment, perhaps debatable, but clear. At least it has the merit of being clear. I then explained to myself why, starting from the unification of the country, no voice among us had arisen to say something eternal to humanity and to be heard throughout the world, except for the voice of Pinocchio. Collodi, now, this seems to me the decisive turning point that truly cuts off any possibility of recrimination or reproach. Or Collodi had a heart greater than his convictions, a prophetic charisma higher than his political activism. Thus, he was able to enter into communion, but perhaps unaware, therefore perhaps unconscious, certainly not declared, into a perhaps unknowing communion with the faith of his forefathers and with the true philosophy of his people. The orthodoxy that could not have overcome in its own garb the sensorial barriers of the cultural dictatorship of the time and of the writer's own explicit conscience, disguised as a fairy tale, burst forth from the depths of the spirit and resounded openly. And in that fairy tale, Italians instinctively recognized their timeless song, while people from all countries could unconsciously sense the encoded presence of a universal message. This assertion also explains the incredible success of this story. Some claim that Pinocchio is in the second most translated book in the world after the Bible. There are, in fact, translations in, I wouldn't say in every language, but certainly in a great many African dialects, as well as Chinese and Arabic. It truly is an impressive thing. It seems like a fairy tale destined never to die, eternal, and Bifi tells us that he has reflected at length on the reason for this strange success. And the answer he gives has, for one, convinced me, and we will examine it together during these evenings, because the answer is probably, in fact, certainly, that Pinocchio, using a coded language, the language of fairy tales, the language of dreams, tells the truth, the eternal truth, that Christian tradition has always known, that ordinary people, the common folk, have always recognized and lived. And since it tells the truth about humanity, it is something every person can recognize. In some way, Pinocchio, well, I'm tempted to say, somewhat paradoxically, the same thing happens when you read Pinocchio. That is a work that does not speak directly about Christianity and instead disguises Christian truths under a fantastical language. But the same thing happens as when you read Dante, which is the most explicit work in terms of professing the Catholic dogma. Yet both clearly have in common the fact that they say something so true, so profound, that they touch, that they reach the most fundamental question, the deepest need of every person. In this sense, it truly becomes a marvelous adventure that we can embark on together, which in turn justifies the fact that it is possible to, besides, it's a common experience. I mean, just think about it. It's always like this. That is, we learn by reading something or by watching, but even just by looking at each other, we learn more than what each person's intention would put into the gestures they make or the words they say. It's not just like that. That is, you have questions, you're curious, you read the signs you see. And often, I think I can say most of the time, you read, find, and discover more than what the other person, through their words or intentions, meant to tell you. You just have to be honest. That is the important thing, is not to make Collodi say what he didn't mean, though to clarify his intentions and to clarify, instead, what happens to you when you read. But once this is stated and made clear, the problem is solved, it seems to me. So we will take this journey together. I just want to make one clarification that I think is necessary. That is this wonderful set design and the title we have chosen, well, that I have chosen, which is The Adventure of Pinocchio. You know that the title of the book is The Adventures of Pinocchio. But I was saying to myself and to the friends who helped think this through, if Pinocchio's story is truly the adventure of mankind, then let's put it in the singular to express exactly that. The adventure of Pinocchio is my adventure, your adventure. And let's write it with a lowercase letter. Let's write it with a lowercase letter to show that it's really a common noun. Common in the sense that it is the story of each of us. is not the uniqueness of one person's story, but rather the uniqueness of a story whose exceptionality lies in being ordinary, that is, in being about all of us. And finally, choice, in short, an idea that seems meaningful to me. In each episode will be helped and introduced also for the purpose of summarizing previous episodes by Pinocchio himself, who in this first evening, of course, not yet being born, not yet formed, is the famous piece of firewood from the wood pile mentioned in the introduction. And speaking of this piece of firewood, we'll begin reading the story by trying to answer a question I've always asked myself, which Biffy answers. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but there's something quite strange. The piece of wood begins its story, its adventure in the workshop of a carpenter, Master Cherry, who then gives it to another carpenter, and that's where it truly begins. After all, the book could very well have started in Geppetto's workshop, with him beginning to carve it. Why does this first chapter, which seems pointless, completely pointless from the perspective of the story, with a character introduced in a very strong way, but who then disappears and is never seen again, exist? Let's try to answer that after the commercial break. So let's take a look at this mystery of the two beginnings of Pinocchio's adventures, of Pinocchio's adventure. And in reality, the mystery is revealed rather quickly because the story, as you know, begins with the famous Once Upon a Time. Now, given the limited time that a single evening TV episode allows, I am forced to simply throw out some inputs, some suggestions, which those who are interested can explore further. Because this first chapter alone would be worth the entire 10-episode series. Just think, even just this strange thing where Collodi corrects the universally accepted beginning of all stories. Once upon a time, there was a king. What? No, kids, you got it wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. This change has always impressed me. Why? Because I have made this observation many times, at least in my personal experience, but also in that of many others. I think I can see this thing that, well, I'll put it this way. The fact of once upon a time raises the question of origins. And Biffy frames it very clearly. What does it mean? Who was there once upon a time? What is there at the beginning? How does it begin? How does each person's story begin, even just in terms of becoming aware of oneself, of reality, of the world, of life? Once upon a time, there was a king, states in a categorical way, very clearly, very explicitly, the beginning of the story, of every story, in a way very similar to, for example, the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word. There is God and there is the Creator before anything else. At the beginning, at the start of every story, He is there. There is the Supreme Being who gives life to all things. But how beautiful is this correction by Collodi from an existential point of view? Because I explained it, and many times, even in class, I found this very intriguing. Because in the end, we do not perceive existentially the problem of God as the first thing. I would say to a 14-year-old, to a 15-year-old, in short, when life really starts to hurt you and brings up those real questions, the first question that comes to you is not whether God exists or not. Yeah, that's the second one. This is the first one from an ontological point of view. Of course, I know very well that if God exists, he must be at the beginning. But from an existential point of view, when you open your eyes to life, start dealing with things, get your hands dirty, the first question isn't that one. The first question that is, but why do we die? But why all this pain? But what is this mysterious attraction that pulls me toward that girl so much that it makes me live with a total devotion? I feel like saying, either with you or life is nothing. What is it? How does one truly love? And then how does one forgive? And then what use does time have? And then why and what is beauty? This is the first question. And it is because we want to answer this question that the question of God arises. Why? Because if we die, and that's a fact, the question immediately comes up. But is there someone who does not die? Is there perhaps someone who even died and then rose again? Could it be true, the news that's been circulating for 2,000 years, that someone actually managed to do it? In other words, the question about God comes afterwards. It's wonderful, I think, this beginning that with the piece of wood. Reality comes first. The questions about things, about life come first. It is there that gradually and gently a true religious feeling takes root. That is the question about God and about being. And look, observations like these could be made about every line, every word, every statement. So in this sense, I ask for your patience for the haste or the speed with which I will touch on certain issues. It was not a luxury piece of wood, but a simple log from the woodpile, the kind that, as we've heard, is put into stoves and fireplaces in winter to light the fire and heat the rooms. I don't know how it happened, but the fact is that one fine day, this piece of wood ended up in the workshop of an old carpenter whose name was Master Antonio, though everyone called him Master Cherry. As soon as Master Cherry saw that piece of wood, he was overjoyed. And rubbing his hands together with satisfaction, he muttered under his breath, "Undine, this wood has come at just the right time." This is the second time we've come across the verb capitare for the master. If the piece of wood is reality, if the piece of wood is reality, just as we perceive it when we open our eyes, as we come into the world, if the piece of wood is reality, then what will be decisive is the position we take in relation to this reality as we look at ourselves and at things. What position do we decide to take? The incredible thing is that this first chapter, which seems useless at first glance, actually clarifies the alternative in a very direct way. In short, it is a truly introductory, preparatory chapter. It's as if Collodi, whether he knew it or not, as we've said, were warning us, saying, look, if you want to follow me along with the story, if you want to understand Pinocchio's journey, there's one condition: you must not act like this. You have to act like the other one, like Geppetto. This attitude that Master Cherry has towards reality is precisely the kind of attitude that prevents understanding, that makes it impossible to truly understand things and to truly love them. And in fact, it has terrible, extremely violent consequences in the relationship between humans and reality. From a certain point of view, and I say this politely, I think I can say it, Master Cherry is the embodiment of modern rationalism, of the modern presumption, supported, sustained, and amplified by a certain conception of science, the modern presumption of understanding everything, of not needing mystery, of not needing to learn anything, because what there is to know about reality we already know. reality cannot surprise us. It is not a mystery. At most, it is an unknown that science will gradually clarify. But it is not a mystery. This is Cherry's reasoning right from the start, from the very premise. Reality just happened. But who cares about its origin? What kind of problem is that? It's not a problem to know whether reality was intended, created. It's here. That's it. Who cares how we ended up here? It's a matter of chance. What exists is left to chance. It just happened. And he starts thinking to himself, this piece of wood came at just the right time. I want to use it to make a table leg. Mercilessly with Lodi, he says that Ciliega really has no imagination. He has no imagination. For him, a piece of wood is just this thing here. If you're lucky, usually it's just good for burning and making a bit of heat. In the best case scenario, the most noble end it can have is to become a table leg, an object, a piece, something I sketch out, something I imagine, and then I take reality and carve out what I have in my mind. No sooner said than done with this fine attitude toward life. No sooner said than done, he immediately grabbed the sharpened axe to start stripping off the bark. But just as he was about to deliver the first blow, he stopped with his arms suspended in the air because he heard a tiny, tiny little voice pleading, please don't hit me so hard. Just imagine how Maestro Cherry, that good old man, felt. It's as if I were to kick your piece of wood right now and we heard a voice coming out of it. Because that's the reality. From a scientific point of view, I can describe it, measure it, weigh it, even work it and get something out of it. But there's more. There's more. There's always more in everything. Montali immediately comes to mind. Everything, even a piece of wood, everything has written on it beyond, there is more than what I can measure or weigh with reason. There is more. And this little voice is that more that exists inside things. That more of which things are a sign, of which things speak. The heavens declare the glory of God. You can study the heavens, of course you should study them. But your knowledge of reality from a piece of wood to the starry sky is not exhausted just because you measure and explain it scientifically. There is more, so much more. Just imagine how he felt. He glanced around the room with bewildered eyes to see where on earth that little voice could have come from. But he saw no one. He looked under the desk, no one. Inside a cupboard, in short, he systematically inspected everything with a very precise method. I go here, I go here, I go here. No one. If there's no one, what does that mean? If there's no one, and I'm not willing to admit, even as a hypothesis, that I don't know everything about this piece of wood, that something might surprise me, if I've decided it's just a piece of wood and there's no one around, what possibility is left? Well then, I get it. He said this, laughing and scratching his wig. It must be that I imagined that little voice myself. In the end, the modern man, in order to account for all the factors, has to call himself an idiot, has to call himself a fool. It must be that I dreamed it up. It must be that I'm mistaken. It must be that I must have been drinking. No, I have to tell you about it. I swear to you, this is a very recent story. I was in a certain city in Asia, formerly part of the Soviet Union. Let's say our conversations, the education was a sort of assembly, let's say, of parents and educators. I say what I have to say, and a lady of a certain age, rather annoyed, stands up and insults me. Well, she makes it clear that she speaks Russian and I speak Bergamasque. So there's a bit of a communication issue, but she makes it clear that something is wrong. I'll keep it short. She asked me how I could have the nerve to talk about God when everyone knows he doesn't exist. I said to her, Mom, all right, but Aga, you really so sure he doesn't exist? I mean, that's quite a statement. And she, a bit scandalized, a bit surprised. Do you know what she said to me? She said to me, so it's true that where you come from, capitalism and culture have told you a bunch of lies, because for us, they told us the truth right away. As soon as Yuri Gagarin, the first astronaut, went into space, he called us immediately and said, look, God isn't there. Convinced, because this is a mindset that has shaped generations of millions of people, convinced that the statement God exists or doesn't exist depends on whether you look around and find him. If you find him, fine. If you don't, he isn't there. Same thing. There is a master cherry who presides over many statements taken for granted by modern culture, both over there and over here. Just to be clear, we are not immune to it. Taking the axe in hand again, he delivered a most solemn blow to the piece of wood. And once more, hey, you hurt me, cried the same little voice. This time, Master Cherry was stunned, his eyes popping out of his head from fear. 3 times in this chapter, we will find the word fear. Why? Because reality, if I live it with all the fragility, the precariousness, the weakness that I know about myself and about how people keep on getting by. I mean, we might be a bit crooked too, but the problem is if the idea of reason I have is an open door through which anything can come in, reality can always surprise me. Or if it's something perfectly neat but remains closed off, I've decided that there's nothing outside, nothing worth knowing, or loving, or giving my life for. But if that's the case, the unknown outside the door is frightening. The mystery challenges you, maybe even wounds you, but it sparks curiosity. It's a good feeling you have toward what you don't know. But if, on the other hand, you've already decided that the mystery doesn't exist, that there's nothing beyond that piece of wood, you have to close the door and pretend that there really is nothing on the other side. And you're afraid of what might be there because it would contradict what you think you know. It would destroy you. Fear is the hallmark of the irreligious person. Just as the call to the religious person is, do not be afraid, it is I. Do not be afraid. How many times does Jesus say this to his friends in the gospel? Relax. With his mouth wide open, as soon as he regained the ability to speak, he began to say, trembling and stammering with fear, but where could that little voice that said, hey, have come from? And yet, there's not a living soul here. Again, the idea that it might be, he even thinks of the right hypothesis. Can you believe it? Could it be by any chance that this piece of wood has learned to cry and complain like a child? I can't believe it. The terrible, icy statement of faith of modern rationalism. Could it be that this piece of wood is not just a piece of wood? I can't believe it. Here is this piece of wood. It's a fireplace log just like any other, and if you throw it on the fire, you can boil a pot of beans. Or then, a terrifying hypothesis. Could there be someone hidden inside? If someone is hidden inside, so much the worse for them. I'll take care of it now. And so saying, he grabbed that poor piece of wood with both hands and began banging it mercilessly against the walls of the room. Then he listened to see if there was any little voice complaining. He waited 2 minutes, nothing. 5 minutes, nothing. 10 minutes, nothing. I get it, he said then, forcing himself to laugh. It seems that little voice that said, oh me, was just my imagination. Again, am I forced to call myself an idiot? Let's get back to work. And because he had become quite frightened, he tried humming a tune to give himself a bit of courage. Meanwhile, having set the axe aside, he picked up the plane to smooth and finish the piece of wood. But as he was planing it up and down for the third time, he heard the same little voice laughing and saying to him, "Oh, stop, you're tickling me." This time, poor Master Cherry fell down as if struck by lightning. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself sitting on the floor. His face seemed transformed, and even the tip of his nose, which was almost always purple, had turned blue from sheer fright. Fear is the last word of the chapter. Fear is the definition, the hallmark of this mysterious character who is what we must not be. It really strikes me, and here comes the analogy. Bear with me. Some of my friends say I'm a bit senile by now, that I become single-minded, meaning I can't talk about anything anymore without bringing Dante into it. But here it fits. I mean, those who have heard me present the Divine Comedy know that one of the things that fascinates me most is precisely the double beginning of Dante's adventure. You'll remember that at the end of the first canto, he decides, well, all right, let's go ahead and I'll follow you. And at the end of the second canto, he says the same thing to Virgil. Go ahead and I'll follow you. Come on, let's go. Why? Two departures. Why a false start? Precisely for this very same reason. The first canto serves Dante to state what the condition is for being able to experience the whole adventure, to be able to make the journey together with him. In the same way, Collodi, in constructing Pinocchio's journey, introduces this first character, this first canto, which serves only to say, kids, do as you like, it's up to you, but if you act like this, if you're know-it-all teachers, if you insist on knowing everything, measuring everything, understanding everything according to the dictates of rationalism, which alas afflicts us, well, if you don't truly open yourselves to things, to reality without the presumption of understanding everything beforehand, of defining it all in advance, if you don't stand before reality as if it were an immense window onto mystery from which so much newness can come, your life will have no possibility of novelty. It will never have, it won't be, as it should be, a new beginning every day. Because at a certain point, you'll have nothing left to learn, nothing left to enjoy, nothing left to live. And you will inevitably become, this is perhaps the most terrible thing in the chapter. You will inevitably become enemies of that very reality which, with the best of intentions, you claim to love, you claim to serve. Our maestro Cilieria takes the piece of wood and with a completely irrational assumption, because he does hear the voice. He keeps looking around and still can't find anyone. And in the end, he comes to this. What is the idea? In short, what is the conclusion of the reasoning behind every rationalism, that is, of every ideology in the end? In the end, the reasoning always ends up with the need for an enemy to eliminate. You have to find yourself an enemy, because if you've said that reality must be a certain way, but reality isn't exactly as you've decided it should be, the only possibility, if there's no mystery, if God doesn't exist, the only serious possibility is this. There must be someone, the enemy, who wants to trick me, who's making fun of me, who disturbs, challenges my perception of things, of life, of truth. And so the enemy becomes identifying the enemy, fighting the enemy, always having an enemy to fight, is the reason why one ends up existing in the world. And it's the basis of all power and every ideology. Why? Because that's how it is. Because it necessarily is that way. If the truth is an idea that I have decided on, that I have in my own head, there's not much to be done. I need consensus. If I say something that I consider true and you say, it's not true in the end, either I or you, if I have the power, I'll say that since I have established that religion is a lie, anyone who still prays will be sent to a criminal asylum, will be sent to the gulag, right? That's how it ended. They'll be sent to the gulag because they are an enemy of what I have established as the truth. It's the emergence of that little voice that I refuse to acknowledge as a possible hypothesis, an interpretation of reality, of life, and of things that I hadn't foreseen. Every maestro Siliegia ends up there, you know? Every ideology ends up there. But it's not an accusation that I or we are making against ideology as such. Look, at each one of us, the choice that Collodi puts before us tonight is radical, but it's not. Simply ideology or mystery. It's not that easy. I mean, at least among us, I think we can say that we all choose the mystery. The problem is that the shortcut of ideology is always lurking. There's this stark alternative. We'll see as we read the second chapter that there is when actually, I feel like doing it now because the crucial thing in the next chapter, that is, Geppetto appears, finds Master Cherry on the ground, asks him for a piece of wood, and Cherry says to him, "But why? What do you need?" And Geppetto says, "I've decided to make myself a nice wooden puppet, but a marvelous puppet who can dance, fence, and do somersaults. And with this puppet, I want to travel the world to earn myself a crust of bread and a glass of wine." What do you think? This is at the heart of the Samban second chapter, because for the rest of it, the two of them are constantly fighting, really, going at each other. Because these two worldviews are irreconcilable, there is no possible compromise. You have to choose, of course, for heaven's sake, everyone makes mistakes. But the two worldviews are fundamentally opposed to each other. Either you are Geppetto, Atil. In other words, when you look at something, you expect wonder, you expect a miracle, because everything has beyond written. On it, everything is a sign of something greater that you feel called to, something you inevitably feel drawn toward. There is a hope, I would say, for the eternal and the infinite, even in the most temporary and finite thing there is. And so life truly becomes a wonderful adventure. It becomes Pinocchio's adventure. Otherwise, the alternative is to be like Cherry. I've already decided everything that this thing is supposed to be. And if it isn't, I beat it to a pulp. He started banging it against the walls of the room. It's a stark alternative that we need to reflect on. And I repeat, Collodi tells us, it's a necessary condition in order to somehow share and experience with him the marvelous adventures of Pinocchio. See you next time.